Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's good to be back in Reykjavik. It's good to be back at Arctic Circle Assembly. I think this is the 10th time that I have attended. You look around the room, it's hard to see from up here because it's so dark, but the conference can't grow any bigger because we have filled HARPA to capacity. And that's a clear sign of where we are and the attention that is focused on the far north. And I'm pleased that we are seeing with each year an ever-growing delegation from the United States. We have representatives here from our departments of state, from defense, energy, the Coast Guard, the National Science Foundation. We have universities represented, think tanks. We have so many that are gathered here from the United States to be part of this open dialogue about this very important part of our country and our shared interests. Last year, I had an opportunity at this podium to kind of trace the evolution, if you will, of our policies in the United States. And I said on that stage that the United States is finally stepping up as an Arctic nation. And I shared how far that we have actually come over these recent years, how we have seen added investment, how our policies have been refined and expanded, how personnel is policy, and how we're really putting all of those key elements into place. And it's one thing to talk about it, but then it's another to actually see that put in play. And so this year, I'm very, very pleased to be able to report on some of that continued process, and particularly proud to be able to report that a founding member of our U.S. Arctic crew has a new title. So many of you have known Dr. Mike Sfraga over the years, and now you know him as U.S. Ambassador Mike Sfraga. We have now confirmed Mike to be our first ambassador at large for the Arctic affairs. Ambassador Sfraga is here this week. He's already representing the United States with distinction on the world stage. So that is good to be able to put a pin in that particular initiative. We've also been working to build out our Arctic infrastructures. You have heard me say on this stage, we are behind when it comes to what many would expect as basic infrastructure in the Arctic. So pushing out on development of our ports and our airports, an eye towards future commerce and the connections that come. We're continuing to work to build on the connectivity that comes with broadband to ensure that we have water and energy projects to close that divide and help lower the costs in these very remote and rural areas. And we saw many positives over this past year, but it also demonstrated very clearly to me, but to so many others, that the importance of our regional alliances and how those alliances will shape the future of the Arctic as much as anything or anyone. Because even as we are stepping up into our role as an Arctic nation, we are recognizing, look, you can't do this on your own. You can try, but it's pretty hard. You can't do it on your own. And we're realizing that in numerous areas that Arctic leadership, it's important. We are in there, we are leading, but it's not as easy as it sounds, and we're realizing the benefits that these partnerships and alliances can bring. One example is icebreakers. You hear me talk a lot about icebreakers because in the United States, we have icebreaker envy. We are working on it, but we are not there. Those of us in Congress have authorized 6 icebreakers. We have fully funded 2. We have provided funding for long lead time materials for a 3rd. Most recently, we signed off on purchasing a commercially available icebreaker that will be home ported in Alaska. That's all great. But our icebreaker program is over budget. It's behind schedule. We have not yet built a single ship. We're already facing delays and overruns. Our commercial icebreaker that we're looking forward to bringing online is going to require significant upgrades as well as shoreside infrastructure before we can really see it at home in the water. Another area, we talk about the connectivity, and we're making some headway. We've got technologies that we are utilizing. We're putting in place Starlink, fiber. We're connecting remote villages, but it's another matter when you're interconnecting nations, and we've got more work to do there. But my point is the regional alliances, this is going to be where it makes a difference, that saving grace. Because our best future isn't America alone, but the Arctic aligned. For icebreakers, we're now talking about what we call the Ice Pact, enabling us to work with Canada and Finland to develop these highly sophisticated ships. For communications, we've got Sweden's KSAT, which is helping to bridge a critical gap by establishing ground stations in Alaska to serve commercial, government, and defense contractors. And we're still doing so much at home. We're continuing to build the icebreakers on our Gulf Coast. We have great satellite launch facilities in Alaska. We've got Poker Flats for rockets. We have Kodiak Spaceport for space launch. We can serve as that test bed for new equipment and platforms to launch them into polar orbits. But we're best served by leaning on one another's strengths to fill these gaps. Because again, I think we all recognize none of us can lead on our own in the Arctic. And this holds true in so many different areas beyond infrastructure, where it's our cooperative efforts in research to better understand the climate impacts from thawing permafrost, from addressing the wildland fires that we are seeing in our northern areas, to dealing with mental health, particularly with our young people in the north. So there's so much that we need to be partnering and working on, these international alliances. But I also want to recognize, and I truly appreciate the Prime Minister's opening comments, because I think it's important that we talk about, or we address a little bit, the elephant in the room, or perhaps in this case, it's the polar bear in the room, and that is our mutual defense in the Arctic. And I know that this isn't typically a forum for defense, but we can't pretend that the future of the Arctic is secure unless we talk about it. National security has forced its way onto the agenda, even here at the Arctic Circle Assembly. We all want this to be a zone of peace. But due to the actions of a few, there is a new chill that is running through the Arctic. We see continued provocations from Russia in Alaska. We see it elsewhere. Russia and China are conducting joint missions in the Arctic, both in the air and on our waters as part of their no limits agreement. We see Russian espionage continuing across the Arctic. Since the last Arctic Assembly alone, when I stood at this podium, U.S. forces have intercepted at least 11 different intrusions of Russian aircraft into the Alaska ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone. This is more than twice the normal average, but we're hardly alone in this. We saw a Russian warship fired a warning shot at a Norwegian fishing vessel operating in Norway's own EEZ in the Barents Sea. Russian spy networks posing as fishing vessels, hanging around critical infrastructure in the north. An unknown saboteur cut communication cables at Norwegian air bases. Self-described near-Arctic nations are also seeking influence in the region as they see opportunity to exploit resources, whether it's energy or fish or something else, seeking control through investments that often result in more harm than good. And I would hope that we can agree that this isn't good, it's not appreciated, it's not positive for the Arctic, but it's also a reminder that so much of what we are trying to build in the far north depends on an allied defense, which in turn requires a stronger physical presence across participating nations. As watchful as we are about Russia and China, 7 of the 8 Arctic nations are now members of NATO. So if an ice curtain is coming down, not many nations appear eager to place themselves on the wrong side of it. So as we look ahead, it is also important to recognize that every country has a role, no matter their size or their might. I was just last week in Palau. It has deflagged several Russian LNG carriers that were seeking to evade the sanctions that we have placed on them. We need that type of courage and conviction to spread in Europe, to spread across the globe. In Europe particularly, we're seeing Russian seafood continue to fuel Putin's war machine and threaten stability in the Arctic. As I think about where we are today, I think about the words that Winston Churchill said. He said, "Our efforts in the Arctic are at the end of the beginning. What lies ahead is certainly individual nations pulling their own weight, but with a collective approach where cooperation and partnership are the standard for all prosperous, peace-seeking, and rule-abiding nations." So at this time, I have the privilege to do something I've never been able to do before, and that is to introduce another person to the stage. And I would like to introduce the man who will help lead the U.S. in that collective effort with his extraordinary knowledge and understanding of the Arctic and the relationships and the diplomacy that he brings to the region that we call home. So I'd like to introduce to you America's first Ambassador at Large for the Arctic region, Dr. Mike Svrega.